Morning again. Glad to see no one ran out of the room when I asked everyone to move down a little bit closer. Today is a little bit different, obviously because of the storm and everything. So I want to do something I've never done before. Some of you may not feel comfortable with this. Some of you may be like, I'm never coming back to church ever again. And I get that. But I'm all right doing this, and here's what I'm proposing. Normally at this time, I usually give a sermon, a long monologue. I present a text and we walk through it. But today, I'm still going to do that. But I'm going to throw out this offer. While this presentation is going on, if you've got a question about something that's being said, because we're a small enough crowd right now, I'm all right doing this. I'm encouraging you guys, raise your hand, ask your question, make sure I'm hitting and everything as clear as I can. I know that's weird, and some people may be like, oh gosh, and I may be in trouble about this later on this week, and I get that. But I can't do that on a normal Sunday morning when there's 200 plus people here. But because we're a small enough crowd, if you have questions, it's okay to ask them, because one of the heart of our church is we want to make sure, whether you're a follower of Jesus or not, we want to make sure that you feel safe and seen and heard, and you are loved, and that you know of the grace and mercy of Jesus Christ. So if there's something that is honestly confusing you with what I'm going to be talking about today, feel free to raise your hand, ask a question. And if it pertains to the topic, I'll answer. If it's something way off left field, we'll talk later on about that later on, okay? But I'm putting a lot of trust in you guys, so please don't shoot me in the kneecap, so to speak, this morning, all right? But before we get into that, would you just join me in a moment of prayer? Jesus, we thank you for who you are, that you are the God who provides good things, that you are the God who is with us in the valley of the shadow of death. Right now, today's a little bit different with this tornado that kind of went through a little bit of our town. Power is out all over town. There's a lot of people who couldn't be here because of the storm, because they're dealing with damage to their homes, or their power is out, and other crises have come up. And so we know that you are with us in this. And today, as we've come into this room and we've brought in all sorts of needs and baggage and weight on our shoulders, we just want to take a moment to take a deep breath, to acknowledge you, and to say that we give you everything, Father. Everything that we've brought into this space, all of our hurts, all of our joys, all of our needs, we bring it all to you right now, trusting you with it, and asking that you would lead and guide us right now as we look into your word. Please show us the truth that you have to offer us today, and may we come out of here saying, man, how great is our God, that he has invited us into a life of purpose and meaning, a life lived with him. It's in your name I pray. Amen. Now, if you're anything like me, when you go home, you probably see in your old bedroom a box of all your old trophies and awards. Maybe you have a shoebox full of all those field day ribbons. Do you remember those when you were a kid and how much you desired those? Now we don't do that, right? But you might have a box full of old trophies, old awards, all the acclimates that you used to want so badly when you're young, and now you're older and you're like, I don't remember what I did to get that, right? I'm sure you probably have that. And if this is a good thing to have, it's a good thing not to probably carry with you, but to probably leave at your parents' house, because it's not something you want to live in the past, but it's something you probably are like, these are stepping stones to the greater challenges of today. This is why as parents, we oftentimes push our kids, right, to play sports or be part of other activities, because we want to give them the stepping stones, the awards, the things that they can one day look back on. When you put the effort in, you achieve this, and today you have greater challenges that if you put the same amount of effort, you'll see some positive results in. So it's a good thing when you go and you look at this box, and maybe you're like me, when you see that, you see the stories of, this is what happens with discipline. This was what happens when you sacrifice. This is what happens when you put hard work involved into something, right? This is a good time to reflect on that because we're at the end of May and this is kind of graduation season. And some of us have graduated from high school or college recently or have family members or friends who have recently and coming up soon. This is the season when it's all about that. And it makes you reflect on, here's an individual who sacrificed a lot, who put a lot of time and effort into something to one day achieve something, to reach a new level, to get to a place that they can look back on and say, those sacrifices were worth it. We all know this is true. This is true whether you're a Jesus follower or not. You know that nothing good comes without sacrifice. Now, we would probably say it's easy to sacrifice things that aren't good to get something better, right? We would say that on paper. It's not always true in person, right? Because we all have our vices and things that are a little bit hard to sacrifice and let go of. But at the very least, on paper, we know, hey, if I want to achieve this, I got to be willing to sacrifice this. If I want to have a certain level of health, then I have to sacrifice maybe my diet and exercise routine and how I'm doing things. Or if I want to achieve this position at my work, I might have to make sacrifices of either getting an education to reach that new level, or I might have to work extra hours or take on extra assignments and things like that. We know to get to something better, we oftentimes have to sacrifice on the journey. And that's okay if we're sacrificing things that are unhealthy. Like we're generally okay with that. It doesn't make it easy, but we're generally okay with that. It makes it a little bit more difficult, right? To sacrifice things that might be good to achieve something better. Like here's this thing that is better for you, but in order to reach it or achieve it, you might have to sacrifice things that are even good to acquire that thing that is better. And here's what makes following God sometimes so difficult, because God over and over and over again keeps promising people he's got something better for them, but it might mean their discomfort of sacrificing things in the temporary moments of today to have something greater in the present or greater in the future. And if we're looking at a series about how do we live in light of eternity, we have to talk about sacrifices. And this was a big topic for Jesus. In fact, this is what made Jesus so radical and so divisive, because he went around proclaiming that he had something which we all really need. And he presented it and said, this is a free gift. This is the thing that you need most in life. But then he followed up by saying, but there's going to be a sacrifice to it. But there's going to be a price to pay. And this is something we oftentimes don't like about. Oftentimes we like a very pacified Jesus of Jesus. Let me just say a little prayer to you, and I get to go to heaven, and I get to have everything I want, and I can still have all of this and know I'm going to heaven. But that's not the message that Jesus gave. Jesus offered something that we all truly need. The things that we're all truly chasing after. He was radical enough to present that he alone offered that. People were divisive over that. Some people were swept up in believing his message, and other people were like, dude, you're crazy, let's kill you. But he stuck to this message, and it's so important because 2,000 years later, we're still talking about the message. Because this is an undisputed fact. Even if you're like, Mason, I don't believe what you believe about Jesus, and I get that. I'm glad you're here if you still feel that way. But Jesus had a way of dividing people, because he would draw a line in the sand and he would say, I have something good for you, but it might require sacrifice in order for you to have it. And he talked about this a lot. One place is in Matthew chapter 13, which is where we're going to be at. In fact, we're looking at like 2 or 3 verses today in Matthew chapter 13. And I encourage you, if you have a Bible, open it up, follow along. Or if you have a Bible app, really encourage you to follow along with this. But in Matthew chapter 13, Jesus starts to give, the whole chapter is about parables of the different stories where he's talking about what does it look like to do life with him. And he's talking to a group of people who are very much like us. People who are seeking after something of true worth in their life. People who feel like they're caught on the hamster wheel, they're spinning their wheels, they're doing the best they can, but they just can't seem to reach that thing which they want, that they've been after. And Jesus speaks to them to present himself. And this might be a message as we're looking at this, that maybe God is going to be nudging you a little bit in this conversation. Because maybe the thing that you are after your entire life, you've been keeping Jesus as this little Band-Aid, this little church aspect for you, but the rest of your life, you're seeking after this one other thing over here, and maybe the very thing that you've been trying to get by your own sheer grit and determination is something that Jesus over here is offering to just give you freely if you trust him. And that's what he speaks to his crowd. So you see this in Matthew chapter 13, which is where we're going to be at. And in Matthew chapter 13, Jesus begins in verse 44 with saying this phrase. He says, the kingdom of heaven. Now, there's nothing that Jesus talked about more than the kingdom of heaven, but it's something that is so incredibly misunderstood today. So before we read the rest of what Jesus has to say about the kingdom of heaven, we have to first understand what he means by the kingdom of heaven. Because typically when we hear of the word heaven, we think of streets of gold and trees that grow donuts that you can eat that will make you skinny, and a place where all your pets are waiting for you and your parents are going to be there too. So that's why you were told as a kid, say this little prayer so you can go to heaven with mommy and daddy. And oftentimes we leave Jesus even out of that conversation, right? That for many of us, that's our perception of heaven, but that was not the perception of what heaven was for the original audience and for the first century, right? For them, they understood it in a very simple but powerful way. It was about the presence of God, that where God was, there was heaven. And so the idea of going to heaven was, I'm going to go be with God in its fullest capability possible, but they believed that was heaven on earth, reality capable for today, and they viewed it in terms of the temple. That's how they viewed the temple, that was the place where God was, that was heaven on earth. But why this was so desired is because if you follow the story of the Bible, it begins with here God made heaven and earth. That's the first line of the Bible. God made heaven and earth. It was this space where God and humanity lived together. But then by our rebellion, by the problems that we created, there was a separation. But for the ancient Israelites and Jews, they believed that God was using them to restore all things. That this was their great mission as a people, that God wanted to bring things back together. He wanted to make all things right, and he was going to do it through his special chosen people. But the problem became that they were just as much a part of the problem as everyone else. And so their interpretation of why they were oppressed in captivity by Rome was because they failed to be who God had called them to be. And so during that time frame, when you lived under Roman occupation, the hope of the people was that one day God's kingdom would come again. That God's kingdom would come and it would set all things right, because heaven, being the place where God was, the God's domain, the kingdom of heaven meant the space where God's rule was on earth, where God was setting all things right. Now, in that context, you're sitting there hoping that a king would come to bring about that kingdom. So in that days of Jesus, there were so many people who stood up and said, I'm that king, I'm that Messiah, and it turns out that they were wrong. And then Jesus comes around and he starts to say things in Matthew chapter 4. He says, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. And what he's referring to, he's saying that he is that Messiah. He's the one who's going to set this world right. And it all was in this context about a relationship with him. So it gives a Sermon on Mount on Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7, where he starts to talk about what does this kingdom of heaven look like? What does it look like to do life with him? And then we get to, by the time to chapter 13, he's talking about the rewards of this. Of what does this look like? So this is very important. If you're going to understand what Jesus is going to say next, he's not talking about a place that you're going to be by saying a little prayer. He's talking about something very specific about life with him. So if you're a note taker, which I encourage you, always take a note, follow along with the message. Don't just be a content zombie, but engage with it. Here's what I encourage you to do. Take a pen and a notepad and write this next to that phrase, kingdom of heaven. Probably underline it and make a note of it. Say something like this, that the kingdom of heaven is not a future place to be, but a life today in relationship to a being. So every time Jesus goes around and says the kingdom of heaven is like this, or repent because the kingdom of heaven is at hand, he is talking about what does it look like to do life with him. You see why that's kind of radical? See why people will be either swept up in accepting what Jesus says or would want to kill him and crucify him? Because he was radical enough to go around to describe what it was like to do life with him. And he talked about this is him as the Messiah. This is what it looks like when God sets all things right. It's about being in a right relationship with Jesus. This is kind of audacious, okay? But we need to understand that background by the time you come to Matthew 13, when Jesus starts to talk about, again, the kingdom of heaven. Here's what he says. He says, the kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field. Well, that's kind of an odd way of putting things, and Jesus likes to talk in odd ways and parables. But he's talking about this kingdom of heaven. What does it look like to do life with him? And he's comparing it to discovering buried treasure. Now, every culture is obsessed with buried treasure, and we are too. This is why we like pirate movies, why we buy metal detectors, why many of you love yard sales, or you're like me and you love to go to used bookstores because you're looking for something valuable hidden in the mess, right? That's something that's very true. So Jesus describes that the life lived with him is a lot like finding buried treasure. It's a lot like, you're looking and here's a place that's all messy and all of a sudden in the ground is something incredibly priceless. That's how Jesus describes the reality of life lived with him that few, unfortunately, ever really found, even those sadly in church. Because you can grow up in church, but not have the kingdom of heaven in your life, not have a real relationship with God. And so this, what he's talking about, he's not talking about how do you be a good church person and how do you attend the right services. He's talking in these parables, as we're going to be reading, about what does it look like to do life with him. And the sad reality of what he's described is that few find it because few are actually pursuing him. And so he goes on, he says this, and the kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field, which a man found and covered up. So the image here is of someone who wasn't really looking for God. Like they were just kind of dragged in and all of a sudden they were swept off their feet and amazed. Like this is someone who, they're maybe only go to church because their spouse brought them or because their kids brought them or because a parent brought them or a friend. They don't really have any interest in God. They're more of wanting to go about their own business in life. They just want to clock in, clock out, be a good person, do the right thing, and then go to bed and start the day over tomorrow. And the life goes on, onward, onward, and onward. It's a life that has no real eternal value and meaning. That's the way it's being described here. And all of a sudden, this individual finds God. They weren't looking for God, but God kind of got a hold of them and they showed them that there is more to life than what's going on. And maybe for some of you, that's kind of your story. Maybe some of you, you're in that moment right now, but maybe for some of you, that's your story. You're like, Mason, I wasn't looking for God. I didn't care about all this, and then one day, something happened. I saw something, I experienced something, the light bulb went off, and I realized that there is a God who loves me, who has a purpose for me, who can change me, who can give my life meaning. That's the story of this guy that's being described. So it's a guy who wasn't really looking for God, and all of a sudden he stumbles upon it, and this is how he reacts. It says, then in his joy, he goes and sells all that he has and buys that field. All right, so let's do a little poll here, a little question. How many of you, if you could go back in time, would go back to like the beginning days of like Amazon and Apple and all that and invest when they're still a little in the garage states, and you're like, yes, I would go back, and they're like, I don't know if we're going to survive the next week, and you're like, trust me, you will, $1,000, right? Like how many of you would want to be that person to do that, right? And maybe some of you even had those experiences, those opportunities come your way, and you look back on them and you're like, I wish I'd invested in that. Whether that was a financial investment of some sort or maybe with time, maybe with an opportunity, and you look back and you're like, I wasted this opportunity, I missed out. And maybe some of you have the opposite story. You did take that leap of faith in something. Maybe it was in a financial investment. Maybe it was in a relationship. Maybe it was with any number of different things, but you took that leap of faith, and maybe people on the other end had told you were nuts. Maybe some people tried to talk you out of it. Maybe people are like, whoa, let's talk about moderation. Let's go a little bit slow here. Let's be a little bit safe. And you're like, no, I've got to take this leap of faith. And then you saw the reward on the other end. That you went through this trial, this journey where maybe you had to tighten your wallet a little bit, or you had to say no, you had to lose some other relationships maybe. But in light of eternity and in time, everyone saw that you were right. Right? So that's what's happening here. Here's this guy who is being incredibly reckless because he sees the value of what Jesus is offering. That's what this guy does. It is reckless. And Jesus is using the story to say that this is what it's like to follow him. He's saying this is the value of what he offers, that if people recognize it, they would be willing to put up with the disapproval of others. They would not listen to all those who told them to stop. They would be willing to sell all they have to have everything that God has them, because they recognize everything that they're walking away from does not compare to what God is offering them. And so they're all right walking away from some relationships. They're all walking away from maybe some opportunities, some jobs, some former way of life, because they recognize that what Jesus offers them is truly better. And they don't want it to hold them back. Kind of makes you wonder, right? Like, what is holding you and I and our families back from having everything that Jesus offers? Because you don't see this a whole lot. But it's beautiful when you see it. Because then you know, here is someone who realizes that what Jesus offers really is better. And they're willing to sacrifice in order to have that which is better. In case this wasn't really clear for his audience, Jesus immediately in the next verse tells another parable for the same people. And he says like this. He says, again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant in search of fine pearls. So in the first story, we've got a guy who just going through the motions, wasn't looking for anything deeper and meaningful in his life, and all of a sudden God got a hold of him. But this second guy is different. The second guy I find is more relatable to most men I have an opportunity to get to know and contact with. Because this is a guy who is actually seeking something of meaning in his life. Like, he puts in the hard work, he has a vision for his life, he knows what he wants, and he's been chasing after it, but he can't seem to find it. He's after something priceless that always seems to just be a little bit out of his reach. And so Jesus describes this guy as a man who's in search of fine pearls. And I know some of us can relate to that. So in this story, Jesus uses this idea of pearls because that was the most priceless thing in his day, and it could stand for wealth. But I think it also, in classic Jesus fashion with the parables, there's always a deeper meaning behind all of this, because we all have our own little pearls that we're chasing after. And so maybe this guy, maybe his pearls was something like a life of happiness and meaning. Maybe his pearl was he wanted a certain relationship. Maybe it was a certain financial status, a certain home, a certain image that he wanted other people to have. Maybe, and this is a big one, maybe the pearl he was after was a father's approval. And he just couldn't get his dad to tell him, "You did a good job. I'm proud of you." Maybe his whole life he was pursuing a pearl that was about the approval of others. He wanted people to see him a certain way, to see him as respectful, to see him as someone admirable or desirable. Maybe that pearl was a sex life, to have it a certain way. Maybe that pearl was a certain education, a certain status. There's so many pearls that we can find in life that we can be so at pursuing. This thing, they're like, if I could just have this thing, everything would be great. This is the thing I need most. This is the thing that keeps me up at night. This is the thing that drives me. This is the pearl, and this is the guy that Jesus is talking about now. The first guy wasn't really looking for anything meaningful in his life, and he just stumbled upon it. The second guy, all he wants is, he knows what he wants, is some priceless pearl. All of his decisions, everything he does is about that pearl. And here's what Jesus says to this guy. Once again, maybe some of us can relate to this. He says, who on finding one pearl of great value, went and sold all that he had and bought it. Again, we have a similar story, but this is a little bit different. This guy has earned some pearls in his life. This guy is a guy, he's earned some accomplishments, he's earned some prestige, he's earned some wealth, he's earned a couple of pearls in his life, but they haven't satisfied him. They haven't been enough. He's put so much effort on collecting this big pile of pearls, and it wasn't enough, but then he finds one that was. And it makes him willing to walk away from all these other pearls. Man, let me tell you, there is something powerful when a man does that. When a man is willing to walk away from the pearls of sex, money, and power, and to have that dream family, or to have that dream job, or that dream home, or to walk away from the approval of needing that approval from your father because you're seeking the approval of your heavenly Father. Man, there's something powerful about that. That's not normal. And Jesus is saying, this is what it's like. You know, this year I've been challenging myself to kind of read the nonfiction of C.S. Lewis, and this week I just got done reading his book, The Great Divorce. And in the story of The Great Divorce, C.S. Lewis and a couple other people have died, and they get on a bus as ghosts, and they get a tour of eternity. And so they first visit hell, and they see what it's like, and they find out that's where they're all kind of destined to end up. That's the place where they're going to be going. But then they have this opportunity where they get off the bus and they have an opportunity to take a trip to heaven to see what that's like. And there they encounter these citizens of heaven who are pleading with them with the opportunity to leave hell behind to be in heaven. But most of the people choose to go back to hell. Because every single one of them has a list of pearls, things that they're not willing to let go of. For some, it's their ego. For some, it's their pride. For some, it's their wealth. For some, it's their ideas and perspectives and thinking that they're a good person. Some, they're like, no, I know what God is like. He's like this, and they won't accept what he actually is like. So many of them have pearls that they're not willing to let go of. They see what is available, what God is offering them, and they're like, but I like these other things too. There's a character in the story that really struck me. It's this little ghost who has this tiny little red lizard that's attached to him that is just sucking the life out of him. It is killing him. And he encounters this angelic being who tells him, hey, if you're going to be here, you got to be willing to let this thing die. And this guy would not let go of this. He's like, no, I need this, even though it was killing him. He's like, I need this. And I was struck by that. I was like, wow, how true is that? That we will not let go of some unhealthy, harmful things to accept what Jesus has for us. And that sometimes we'll even put things that are good things, but we'll put them as greater value than to have what Jesus offers us. This is not a comfortable message. See, Jesus is talking about a guy who has earned a lot of good things in his life. But he's recognizing that what Jesus offers is so much better. See, Jesus is not making an argument that you can buy your way into the kingdom of heaven. No, he's talking about how great of the offer that he has for us. How much better it is, and that when someone comprehends that, they're willing to let go of things, to sacrifice, to walk away from some unhealthy things, and maybe even some things that are good but of lesser value that God doesn't want them to have right now. Which is something we all do because we all create our own idols all the time, right? And our idols are not always of the unhealthy things. Sometimes our idols are of the good things. And so here Jesus is talking about a guy who is willing to walk away from a lot of things to have something of greater value. This is not an easy message, my friends, because it's not easy to walk away from things like this. It's not easy to walk away from needing the approval of others. It's not easy to walk away from trying to have your security in wealth and place it instead your security in a trust in God. It's not easy to walk away from to needing sex, money, and power because you're trusting God more. It's not easy to do these things, Father, my friends. But it's good. And those who take that journey do it because they recognize, God, you offer me something so much better, and I'm trusting in that, and I want that. There's a guy named Jim Milley. You probably have heard this quote. He wrote this. He says, "He is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain that which he cannot lose." There's really two rules to understanding these parables that Jesus is talking about: understanding and action, and they must go together. Because you can understand what Jesus is talking about. You can understand what he offers and all that, but without action, it's sterile. But if you're all about the action and you don't understand why you're doing what you're doing, you're going to get burned out. And that action is all going to be useless and it's going to be misguided. But if we live recognizing Jesus offers me something better, and I want what Jesus wants, that's when we walk in light of eternity, my friends. You see, living in light of eternity is worth any present-day sacrifice. Living in light of eternity is worth any present-day sacrifice. What God has done in Jesus is to fulfill all of his promises. He is setting things right. And we get the opportunity to look at Jesus and say, Jesus, I want what you offer me more than the things I've been chasing after. That I'm trusting the things I've been chasing after. I'm trusting them to you so that I can seek you. That's not easy, but it's good. And we need more people who are willing to do that. In fact, I'm going to be honest. We need men. Men, you are needed, who are willing to say those very words to Jesus, who are done pursuing pearls of lesser value, but their heart is pursuing the greater pearl that Christ offers, the one that makes a change in your homes and your families. Because when men do that, you know what they find? That they're less concerned about making everyone happy, that they're more concerned about the approval of God than others, that they're less interested in what is on their phone and more interested in the people around them, that they're more interested in doing what God has called them to do, not what their lust and their desires are, that there are people who invest back in others and build one another up and encourage one another, who are violent men in a good way. We're taking the battle to the enemy. That's what we need. Men who are looking at the field and are willing to sell everything to have it. Men who are done chasing after lesser pearls to have what is greater that God offers. We need that. This living in light of eternity requires present-day sacrifices. For us to move into this space over here is going to require present-day sacrifices so that we can create a space that for years to come, people will walk in. People who will question, oh man, does God love me? Can God really change my mess? Can God really do something in my life? And we can be able to say, look at what this space used to be and what God has made it now. And let that be a visible sign of what God can do in your own life when you seek after him, when you're willing to follow him. And many of you have taken the saying of, yes, I want to be part of that, and you've pledged, and that is awesome. And we're going to share that next week. But for those of us who maybe you're on the fence, maybe you're like, I recognize that there's value that Jesus offers. I'm not willing to put my cards on the table. I'm not willing to really trust him with that. Maybe today is a day that you need to wrestle with Jesus about that. Of what's really more valuable in your life. What God may be offering you, or the things of lesser value. And I'm not saying that in reference to the building, I'm talking about in life in general. And I recognize that's not a fun message. These are the things that made Jesus, people walk away from him and eventually want to kill him because they're like, man, we don't like that guy. We like it when it's a nice, easy message of, let me just say this little prayer and I'll be good. Let me just check off the box. I went to church, I'm good. But Jesus wasn't interested in making good church attenders. He It was about making followers and disciples, people who really wanted him. God does something with people like that. We're going to take a moment and pray now. I'm going to ask you all to bow your heads, close your eyes. And I'm just going to have a moment to be quiet because maybe you need to be a little bit honest with God today. That maybe for some of you, you need to wrestle with, okay, am I one of those two men in the story? Am I the person who, I really don't care, and I think this is all bogus, and I've just been going through the motions, but then maybe, just maybe, there's something real to this, of what Jesus offers. And maybe for some of you, you need to pray to get you right with God at this moment. Or maybe for some of you, you're like, yeah, I want a little bit of Jesus, and I want a little bit, or really a lot of all these other things, and maybe this is a time when you need to just be honest with God of, what pearl are you after? Is it the one that Jesus offers? Or are you trying to have a little bit of Jesus and you're looking for all these other pearls? Maybe this is a time of freedom for some, an opportunity for you to be real with God. Maybe just to say yes to him. So I'm going to be quiet for a moment and let you just be with Jesus right now. Jesus, I don't preach this message today as someone who has mastered this because I recognize, even this week, you gave me clarity about lesser pearls I was after. And so I know we are all works in progress here in this room. And I thank you for the ways that you maybe are speaking in the hearts of some. Because we're all so easily tempted these days to just put you into a little manageable box. That way, we'll just pull out the box every now and then when we feel like coming to church, or we want to be seen as a good person. So we pull out the little Jesus box and, oh gosh, Father, that is so disrespectful to you and to what you offer. And sometimes we find ourselves sabotaging ourselves because we run after so many lesser pearls. I'm just as guilty of that. You showed me things this week with the question of, do you want this or do you want what Jesus offers? So Jesus, I ask for your forgiveness for the ways I've tried to bargain with you, try to have it all, or have what you don't want me to have. I ask for your forgiveness. And together, hopefully with others in this room, say how much we want you. That you offer something so much greater. You offer a new life and a new beginning. And we all need that, Father. Because yesterday was hard, and so is tomorrow probably be hard for some as well. And we're going to mess up and we're going to make mistakes. But we need your grace and your mercy. We need your purpose. We need meaning in our life. You offer us these things. And so we're saying yes to you. And I thank you for those in this room who have the heart and the boldness and the courage to say yes to you as well. Who are willing to say, I'm willing to sacrifice And I'm willing to walk away from things to have what God wants me to have, to be who God has made me to be. And I'm thankful that there are hopefully men in this room who will say the same thing, who will go back to lead their families and their homes, who will be leaders in the community. I'm grateful that there are women in this room who are saying yes to you as well, who will go back to do the exact same thing, so that we might be your people who live in light of eternity, who love you, and who seek you first. It's in your name I pray.